Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. In 2020, W3C, after 2 or 3 years of conversations, finally published a new process which supports living standards, which is a significant change for W3C. I wanted to come back to that. If you're participating in a working group, what does it mean for you? But I also wanted to talk about reviews. We've been increasing our emphasis on wide reviews and our understanding on how those are getting done. So what was wrong with the previous process? And nothing really was wrong with it. It was just that it was just too limiting for us. We have a lot of working groups and they come from different horizons. They're addressing the needs of different communities. And we wanted to expand what the process was allowing working groups to do on the recommendation track. So with the previous process, if you wanted to make a substantive change or addition to a recommendation, you were required to go back in time, quotes, in the sense that you were required to go back into the previous stages, either candidate recommendation, known as CR, or first public working draft, all the way to the beginning of the rec track, what is known as FPWD. Another problem was we have a lot of long-running specifications that could take years to bring to recommendation. CSS has a long list of those. Another well-known one has been WebRTC, where WebRTC started 7 or 8 years ago, and it is still not a recommendation. And with the previous patent policy, the royalty-free commitments were only settled once you were becoming a recommendation, meaning you were guaranteed to have a royalty-free license only if the document was a recommendation, but not before then. So for a document that was being developed over the times and we had multiple implementation, that was not great at all. Then we changed our understanding or our approach to specification. Over the time, I would say we moved away for a bit from writing the specification just for users in general, but more writing the specification for implementers. And it's always a balance. We never get it right, and we'll probably never get it right either. But the fact is, nowadays, if you read a lot of our specifications that are deep into the web platform stack, you will see a lot of algorithm. And those need constant maintenance and updates consequently. And it was very important that people look at the latest version of this to make sure that they were looking at the latest version of this. So any delay in publishing and updating the document in /CR wasn't desired. It led to a lot of confusion. Which document do I need to look at, and so on. And plus on top of that, you know, some groups are good at maintaining built-in consensus and testing into their editor's draft. By construction, they only merge changes to the editor's draft if it has a consensus of the working group. So they fulfill a lot of the requirements that are on the right track, but they were not updating /GR because it can take months. And again, it was creating confusions as well. You probably have heard and still hearing, unfortunately, a lot of don't look at the document on w3c.org, look at what's on the GitHub instead in w3c.github.io, because that's where all of the editor's draft nowadays, most of the editor's draft nowadays are. So today we have 37 working groups, and they all have different standard stories. If you go and talk to them, which I do, you will hear different needs and different stories. They won't hear the word recommendation in the same way. Some will say we don't need recommendation because we're doing a pure living standards. Our spec is changing all the time. And yes, some parts of the spec are stable, some parts are unstable. And it's very difficult to pinpoint a point in time where the spec is actually stable as a whole. A good example of that has been a service worker specification that we've been struggling for the past 2 or 3 years to pinpoint a point where in time where we can say, okay, this is a spec now, let's make it a recommendation. Despite the fact that we have all of the testing and everything, SVG has been long running. SVG2 will probably, with the level of resources we unfortunately have in the working group, will probably won't issue a recommendation out of it at the moment. So if you take the other end of the spectrum, we have groups like the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, that is where the document is being referenced in regulation. So they cannot simply update the document at all time because this is not how regulation works. So they need to have recommendation settled in stone, stable, and long running. So for example, we in the process of superseding WCAG 1.0, we have 2 recommendations on our website. In addition to that, 2.0 and 2.1. And despite the fact 2.0 was published several years before 2.1, we are still not going to supersede 2.0 because it is still being used out there and linked to. So those, I would say, the 2 extremes between cases like service worker and the WCAG documents. And then you have, documents that are in between, and that they are like happy to publish recommendation, but they also keep working on the specification of the site. So they always have the next version in the pipeline as they are finishing their recommendation of the first one as well. And if you even look at the level of implementation, it varies quite a lot as well. Some draft, like working draft, will have no test or implementation commitment. So they are just pure work in progress. Some, on the other hand, have test and implementation commitments. So they are much advanced on those criteria. So they may again fulfill criteria that are expected later on in the recommendation track, but they are just fulfilling them much earlier, and no one asserted that, at least not the director. So nowadays what we do is we do obsolete automatically and supersede once the recommendation is produced anyway, if the working group tells us to do so. But we still have a lot of, the story could be confusing for the outside participant. So when we look at all of those issues, we had to make a bunch of trade-off with the values. Yeah, at the end of the day, if you compare an editor's draft, which hasn't been published in /TR, or a document in a community group for what is worth, compared to a recommendation, the set of qualities are substantially different. We expect adequate implementation experience for a recommendation. We don't expect that for a community group. And we expect to have some way to actually check this adequate implementation experience using tests and so on. So it has been reviewed by the director. The director checks that indeed the working group fulfilled the criteria. The SC had a chance to review it as well. As a whole, we've been securing the royalty-free on a regular basis, and therefore once it's for recommendation, it's royalty-free and so on. So going through all of that list of values, which again, some of the working draft or even community group reports are already fulfilling, it's just that they were not checked on. We had to make some trade-off. And this brings us to the process 2020 recommendation track. So the new process is in effect since mid-September, and all of the working group as of today are operating under this new process. They were switched automatically to this new process. We do not have working groups operating under the old process anymore. So one of the goals is to basically allow the working group to map what I would call their standard stories to which they want to fulfill for their community to the new recommendation track. So if their community expect to have the latest and greatest, and the living standards model is what they would like the service worker working group, they can do so. And on the end of the spectrum, if they still want to have the well-established standards, in fact, what was done in the previous process, they can still do so. They don't have to change anything. And one of the big advantages of this is we updated the patent policy as well, and we can secure the royalty-free commitments a lot earlier in the recommendation track than just at recommendation time. And I'll come back to that. And so we did some subtle balancing of what was the values from the previous process to embracing the new values. But one important thing to remember is if the previous recommendation track was working for you, you can still do it. You can that's still an option. You do not have to change anything. And we do expect some groups to not change anything. So as I just mentioned in the previous slide, we had to secure the patent royalty-free commitments earlier, which required, for the first time, a major revision of the patent policy, which we achieved. As of today, we haven't switched all of the working group to the new patent policy because it requires an explicit acknowledgement from the organization participating in the working group. Only the new charters that are approved by the directors since mid-September are under the new patent policy. For the other ones, we have a transition plans where either they are about to get rechartered anyway, therefore they will be switched to the new patent policy as part of their rechartering, or if they are beyond the March 2021, what we're going to do starting next week is to query the team contact and share of those working groups to ask them if they are interested to switch to the new patent policy. And assuming they are, we will switch them to do so on December 1st, asking the organization to rejoin. If they are not interested, then they will stay under the old patent policy until their current charter expires. And at that time, the new charter will be required to use the new patent policy. So I expect, for example, the payments working group to stay under the old patent policy for the time being, because the process of rejoining is quite costly for them, and they probably may not be the only one. We do wanted to keep enforcing the checks on wide and horizontal review. It's a wide review is a fundamental value of our process, and I'll come back to more details on that. But when we issue those royalty-free commitment requests to during the call for exclusions, and at the end of the call for exclusion, this is where they are settled in stone. But before doing so, the directors get to check to see if there was proper wide and horizontal review done. It does not mean that all of the issues would have been resolved, but depending, like if you're still, for example, in first public working draft or coin recommendation snapshot, but it does mean that we are looking into that. So we can finally enable the living standards model without preventing today's workflow for the working groups that are still relying on recommendation. And another advantage of those changes has been that we're no longer forcing specification to go back in previous stages, and they can update the recommendation directly. And again, I'll come back to that. So all in all, this allows us to actually be a lot more agile and answer the needs of the web. So if you look at the recommendation track of 2020, this is what now it looks like. where you have at the top, you have the 5 known stages. The first public working draft, the first time the working group publish it. Then you have a series of working drafts that are being published, which could be 0 or more. And then you have what we call a Korean recommendation snapshot. So the first Korean recommendation being published is automatically a snapshot. And this is approved by the reviewed and approved by the director, this publication. And then the working group may update this snapshot, may publish interim phases, by the way, called Korean recommendation draft. At their will, there is no check. So they can maintain the document in /tr by just simply deciding to do so on their own. We do expect those groups to publish a snapshot between 6 months to 2 years in terms of frequency. Less than 6 months is not desired because we do not want to flood the IP lawyers with call for exclusion request. Every time we publish a Korean recommendation snapshot, we do issue those call for exclusions, securing the royalty-free commitment at that time. And if the working group is interested in publishing a recommendation, they can move to propose recommendation as long as they haven't made any substantive changes since their previous publication in /tr. Otherwise, they would be required to publish a new snapshot before doing so. So we can actually issue the call for exclusion properly. Then they are in the normal cycle propose recommendation. Now, on the right side of that graph, you have the other side of the equations in process 2020, which is how to update recommendation. So as I said previously, you were forced to go back in previous stages in the past if you were making substantive changes. This is no longer the case. You can actually update your recommendation by making candidate changes into the document through annotations, where you are basically exposing the type of changes you would like to do to the rest of the world. And when you believe that those candidate changes are actually ready to be integrated into the recommendation, you republish the document again, but this time you make them to be proposed changes. Proposed changes, when we see a recommendation published with proposed changes, we will issue a call for exclusion and an AC review of those proposed changes. So we are measuring into one single operation every requirements that were required by CR and proposed recommendation, meaning we're going to expect at the end to see adequate implementation experience, that the call for exclusion was done properly, and that the AC review was also done properly. Everything goes well, the director allowed the recommendation to be republished yet again, but this time they are no longer proposed changes, they are folded as part of the normative part of the specification. And you can go through this cycle endlessly. So you can have what I call a living recommendation if you want to. One note, however, when you do that is for if you do have new features, the process is clear that you can only do so if you are allowed to do so by your own proposed recommendation. So now when you switch to proposed recommendation, we will make sure that you understand that if you want to update later on the recommendation with new features, you should say so when you publish your proposed recommendation. And like that, it gives a chance to the AC to comment on it as well. But if you are allowed to do that by your own proposed recommendation, then you can your proposed changes can include new features. If this is not the case, you're going to be requested to go back in previous stages, to go back to first public working draft. So at the end, what you have is different models, and keep in mind they can be combined. One model does not necessarily mean that you cannot use the other one. So the living standards models, what I would call the candidate recommendation forever, is you publish your first public working draft, and you may publish a series of working drafts in between. And then at some point, you're going to publish a recommendation snapshot. And you keep updating it through a series of candidate recommendation draft and candidate recommendations forever. So this is very similar to, of course, to the W3C model, which publishes snapshot every 6 months of their documents for the pattern, what they call the pattern review draft, and otherwise, the spec is being kept updated at all time, and so that's what this model is based on. The old model, which is, we need to have a stable normative reference and we want versioning, therefore the 2.0 and the 2.1 are two different versions and they need to live in their own space. And they cannot be superseded just like that, is still available, where you basically, again, you go from first pre-working draft to recommendation. And if you want to have a new version, you would go back, you would basically go and publish a new document, starting from first pre-working draft again, which is what will happen in the W3C Content Accessibility Guideline 3.0, in this case. But if you do want to be able to, if you do want to update your recommendation, instead of because you're making some fixes, or because really you want all of the value of the recommendation, you want all of the assertion that the directors and the AC got to review the changes and so on, you can do that by having a living recommendation, where you move to recommendation and you stay in recommendation forever. And on /tr, you will always see the latest version of the recommendation, consequently of that. So as I said, it's possible to, for example, to have living standards, and then from time to time you want to publish a version. And so it's certainly possible to do that. Once you're in recommendation, you can make substantive changes into your living recommendation if you want to. You can only, again, introduce new features if you allowed yourself to do so at the proposed recommendation time. But you can also decide to, no, we will go back and publish a first pre-working draft for an entire new version. So I wanted to talk a little bit about versionings. First, a reminder, the first bullet is we do have a document that talks about version management in W3C reports to give some direction on how we do that. Every time we published a new dated version of a given version, we automatically update in /tr nowadays the previous, the old date. We give those warnings to say, watch out, you're not looking at the latest dated version of this document. When you do publish newer versions, we may obsolete or supersede all versions. It's up to the working group to do so. What we recommend the groups is that they actually write into their document what is the relationship between this new version and the old ones. And if they do so, if they do indicate that that the new version is superseding the old one, we will highlight that fact to the AC. If they don't, then it's going to be up to them in the future to do so. So right now, for example, we are running an AC review to obsolete WCAG 1.0 because the working group asked us to do so. But we are not doing so for WCAG 2.0 because the working group still want to keep that version alive. As a matter of fact, by the way, as for the past 3 to 4 months, our API, underlying API that manage all of those data about those technical reports, understand versioning and knows that, for example, the pointer event specification has several versions. If you're clicking on that link, by the way, it will provide a view of that information as exposed through our data. And we hope that the data is correct. But since we haven't exposed it very widely yet, you may still find some errors in those data, and feel free to do so. I provided a link at the end to where you can access the boards of all of the working groups, and you actually can check all of those information in those boards. So on updating recommendation, the process basically categorize more than 3 categories. The first one, which wouldn't be there, is like if you have to make a markup change in your spec, the change can be done in place. We don't expect a new dated version. And all of the things that the working group has to do is send a request to the webmaster. If you do make editorial changes, we do expect a new dated version of the recommendation. We will update automatically the previous one. But again, the working group can decide to do so, reach out to the webmaster to do so. It's relatively easy to do. If you make substantive changes, however, that when it comes up a little bit more trickier, because we would not expect you to make those changes directly into the recommendation, of course, nor into a new dated version of the recommendation. We expect them to be validated. So we would expect you to publish first a new dated version of the recommendation with which would contain annotation for candidate and/or proposed changes. The candidate changes are changes that the working group is thinking about, but they are not ready yet to request to be folded into officially as part of the normative part of the specification. What the proposed changes are, they are ready, and the working group would like the review. So for those, we would issue a call for exclusions. We would send an open AC review, asking the AC opinion about those proposed changes, and we would expect at the end of that to see all of those results, including if we have adequate implementation experience, like we would expect from a candidate recommendation at the end of a candidate recommendation. And if everything is fine, after approval of the directors, you can basically incorporate the proposed changes that were approved directly into your new dated version of the recommendation. And you can imagine that the cycle is ending. In fact, as far as I know, nothing prevents a working group to already include a set of candidate changes on the day they publish the first recommendation, ironically. A lot of the changes were driven with the need to make sure that the documents in /TR are up to date. So we wanted a process and a tooling that basically allow us to do so very easily. So as a reminder, we have a system called Echidna, which allow you to publish a document in /TR, and it could be, we have even a script to do so automatically on GitHub when you are merging changes into the main branch of your repository if you want to do so. So we have a few documents that are, if you look at the editor's draft and the version in /TR, they are pretty much exactly the same, except for the headers, basically. If you're not quite sure what to do, we have a step finder where you open it, you look for your document in there, assuming it has been published in /TR before, and it will tell you, depending on the stage you are at in the recommendation track, it will tell you all of the options that you have available to update your document, either while staying in the same maturity level or moving back or enforce in the recommendation track. And we would encourage the groups to update the recommendation at all, pretty much the whole time, using the candidate recommendation draft. Do not let /TR gets rotten. So that's it for the introduction of what was introduced in the new process and new patent policy on that. And talking about review. So review is not new in the process. There's nothing changed in the process when it comes down to review, really. But on the other hand, the way that we've been practicing the process has changed substantially in the past I would say, in the past 2 to 3 years. Historically speaking, we have two groups who have been doing for at least 20 years horizontal review quite a lot. Those are the internationalization working group and the web accessibility activity, the architecture and platform, the accessibility and platform architecture group, APA, that have been doing what we call horizontal review. We stepped up our game substantially thanks to Sam on doing privacy and security reviews. We stepped up our game to do architecture review as well when the tag was created several years ago, and they also have a proper workflow to do those reviews as well. The first link on the first bullet, by the way, is a presentation done by Ralph Swick and Sam Weiler for the AC meeting, and I encourage you to look at that presentation as well. You know, it's very important for us to do reviews because the web is for all, and we want to make sure that it actually can work for everyone as well. And everything has to be reviewed. Any technical specification has to be reviewed. First and foremost, all of the working drafts have to be reviewed. And Richard Ishida and Sam Weiler have updated the wide review guide last month or so. And again, you'll find a link on how to do wide reviews there as well, but I will come back to that. I also encourage community group to request wide review. Not all of the horizontal groups will necessarily have the ability to do the review of the report, but I know that the privacy interest group and the tag are both more than willing to do reviews of community group reports when they see them. So when do you do wide review? The thing to remember is the earlier the better, and the perfect is always the enemy of the good enough. I've seen too many working engineers telling me that I still have one change to do, and for months they are not going to request review. When I know pretty well that if they do, they're gonna get a bunch of issues, so do not wait to be perfect for your specification, because if you do so, you are guaranteed to be late. Because if you are getting a comment that is impacting your architecture, this is going to be painful for you to change, and this is going to be painful for horizontal group to get you to change it as well. So the earlier the better, do not wait. Again, community groups may also request reviews. We've seen community group reports where some of the browser vendors are implementing already. So it's not even on the standard track yet or inside a working group. It hasn't been adopted by a working group. So I encourage those to review sooner rather than later. If you made any substantive changes since the last time you had a review, request it again. We will ask you, the director will ask you to make sure that any substantive change to your specification got a chance to get reviewed. And if you didn't have a review in the past 2 years, even if your document did not change, request again. In the best case scenario, the horizontal group and the community is going to tell you, well, nothing changed, there is nothing to review, that's fine. In the worst case scenario, you may be told, well, our understanding of this scope of this space has changed substantially in the past 2 years, and you're going to have to make some changes because what you're doing is no longer acceptable, or no longer the norm, I would say. A good example of that is in the privacy space, where our understanding of privacy has evolved substantially in the past 2 years, and our expectations have been evolving as well. So how do you do a wide review? So again, I encourage you to look at the presentation that Sam Weiler and Ralph Swick did for the AC meeting on that. But a short summary here is first, make sure that your status of the documents that says that your document is ready for wide review. We do pick that up in our tooling down the line, and we advertise those documents in the proper space to get the attention of the community and the horizontal groups on that. So that's why it's important to mention that in your document, even if it is only a working draft. Another good way, by the way, additionally, you should look at your charter. Very often, charters will contain dependencies, either with W3C groups or with external groups. Like, for example, if you are touching or extending HTML, we're going to list the W3G in the external group. If you are working on WebRTC, it's very likely you will see one or more ATF groups being listed in your charter as well. And again, the expectation would be here that you actually reach out to those groups to make sure that they had a chance to review your document, and we would be looking for those things. And more specifically, we always expect you to reach out to the horizontal groups, whether you are working on WebAssembly or pointer events. We will expect you to reach out to the internalization working group, to the accessibility, to APA as well, to the tag, and so on. Whether or not your document is necessarily touching on UI or contains strings, we will expect you to reach to all of them. Best case scenario, those groups will tell you, yeah, we concur with you, there is nothing to review here, you're fine. The check doesn't cost a lot of time as well. On that, most of those groups, by the way, horizontal groups, will have questionnaires to help you to self-assess your specification as well, or the set of changes you want to be looked at. And so you can already provide those self-assessment to the horizontal groups to help them process your request faster. In any case, you must expect the directors, when you need director approval, to move along the recommendation track to make sure you offered a reasonable opportunity to the world to review your document. If not, we're going to tell you, yeah, you need to do a bit more work on that. We are nowadays tracking horizontal issues. We have a board for that, which is actually we're using underneath. We are basically using GitHub and GitHub labels to do that. So the board is only exposing information which exists into the GitHub repositories. It's just a view of those information. We've been spreading for the past, I would say, 8 to 9 months, labels across 285 repositories we now, as of today, have on the list to associate issues based on the horizontal dimension, whether it's IATN, privacy, tag, and so on. So basically, when you have an issue being open on your specification that you believe can be touching on internalizations, you should put a label called IATN-tracker. And that will automatically show up in the radar of the IATN working group, just to alert them that this issue was flagged for their attention. The horizontal groups, however, they have a way to say that, no, an issue is very important and it really needs a resolution. And that's where the needs resolution version of those labels come into. So those are meant to be used by the horizontal groups, not by the other groups instead. So we would expect the horizontal group to set up the needs horizontal resolution. And that basically tell the working group, the specification impacted, that yes, the horizontal group believes that this is a very important issue that needs resolution. And that also tells the director as well. That also allows the directors that when you try to move forward, a specific issue is important, has been flagged by the horizontal group as important, and the documents should not be moving to propose recommendation without a proper resolution. So as of today, by the way, we are tracking, almost 500 horizontal issues that have been made or flagged on the specification. And the fun fact is, yes, as of today, we are tracking almost 13,000 open issues on our specification. If you don't know what to do over the weekends, we have a lot of open issues on specification for you to go go through. So facilitating transitions. So the transition requests are still, unfortunately, being tracked on GitHub. Actually, no, fortunately, they are still being tracked on GitHub. We do not have yet, unfortunately, the proper form to submit transition requests nor wide review as of today. And consequently, we do not have yet the automatic transition way to be able to facilitate director's approval. Consequently, but again, it's kind of like, unless you have formal objection on this resolution, it's very likely that we would basically allow you to, the automatic system will allow you to publish your kind of recommendation snapshot without much, without human intervention, pretty much. So finally, on more information, you always have the guides. Please look at it. The wide review, how to do a wide review is linked from it. There are a lot of links appearing in this guide. I apologize about that because there is a lot of information. We have a series of tools and boards and so on to basically keep track of our working groups, and you have a link to that. This is what the project management team, what I'm using as well. When you're in doubt, always go to your team contact and ask, or come and ask me as well, instead of staying in your corner. We will always be happy to help you on that front. And on that, it concludes the presentation part of this breakout session.